we get caught up in thinking that there's like only one way, or that our whole theology is going to fall apart if one gospel says something different than another.
Yeah.
And as opposed to like looking at these stories with all the nuance, it makes it so much more real to me, because it just puts me into looking at the story as less of a caricature or a cartoon or like a going through the motions or a dramatic reading at church, and actually trying to imagine this historical moment and the implications of that.
Hello, and welcome to the Ancient Jesus Future Faith podcast. I'm Tana and I'm one of your hosts. I'm here, as always, with my co-hosts, Sarah Minardi.
Hello.
And Don Sheaver.
Hey.
And today we're going to talk about Judas. At the time that this episode will air, we'll have just passed Easter. And Don has had some interesting things to teach about Judas over the years. So we thought maybe we would focus on that today. And to get us started, though, let's just talk about, like, what is the basic Judas story? What have we been taught about Judas? Just
Judas
to sort
is
of
so basic.
So basic. So just to establish like the baseline that we're working on, so then Don can come in and mess it up.
I don't know how to feel about that.
You can challenge it. How's that?
Right.
Challenge the narrative.
Okay.
Well, I think Judas is always painted as the typical villain, bad guy, especially like in movie portrayals. It just not really any depth to the character. Almost like in some of these video presentations, I feel like when you see the disciples and before you know who's who, you can just tell which one the casting director put as Judas just by looking at them, you know?
That's funny.
So yeah, and we've talked a little bit about that before, about like how watching movies and artistic interpretations can be good and how to be careful with that, because we don't want to base our theology around things that are stretched or not as nuanced because they're put into performance mode.
Yeah.
But yeah, the typical bad guy who betrays Jesus with a kiss in the garden and gets the money, and then doesn't he throw back the money and then doesn't end up taking it?
Yep.
And then commits suicide. And I've heard some teachings talking about the different ways he possibly could have died, like impaling himself on something. So I'm not sure why, like, of all the things to dig into, like, because I think there's been some teachings of, well, I don't even know if we want to go that far into it, but yeah, just different ways, like discussing, like,
I do think the reason, particularly his death, is because there's two different stories depending on the gospel of his death, and I think in order to make those two mesh, because they're different, to make those mesh, they've created a very what's the Goldberg?
Rube Goldberg?
Rube Goldberg machine of suicide.
because people are uncomfortable with the Bible contradicting itself.
Yes.
Right.
Yeah.
So he has this very convoluted death. He would make William Shatner impressed with his death scene, according to most pastors.
I betrayed my savior.
I always listen back to podcasts at 2x speed, and I'm so curious as to how that's going to sound.
It'll probably not make any sense. It'll just be like blurps of sound. But anyway, yeah. So basically, the narrative is Judas was the disciple, that the apostle that betrayed Jesus. And at least for me growing up, that it was always just like 100% Judas was bad. Like,
Yeah.
And what he did was terrible. And on the surface of the story, that makes sense. Like, he goes in and he brings the soldiers, and it's all his fault that Jesus got crucified, kind of a thing. But Don, over the years, you've taught some interesting messages about the Judas story. So I thought maybe we could dig into that today.
I think to sum up how Judas is kind of viewed and treated is, if I walked up to either of you and said, "You're such a Judas,"
Yeah.
I mean, instantly it would be like, fisticuffs.
Yeah.
As opposed if I walked up to you and I said, "You're such a Jesus."
Right.
And maybe if I said it like that, that would be weird too. But we've made Judas kind of a descriptor. Very similar to the way a lot of evangelical or Protestant churches will use the word Pharisee as a
Right.
negative, and I don't think it should be. I think that that's harmful. I think that we do the same with the name Judas.
Yeah, you don't
And
hear any churches named after Judas.
yes, Saint Judas.
Peter and Paul.
Yes, Saint Judas Lutheran Church.
Yeah.
Not going to happen anytime soon. That's funny. So I think the first place I want to kind of start is where I kind of got fumbled up a little bit. And that was several years ago, probably, oh boy, I don't know that I want to count. A lot of years ago. I was reading Soren Kierkegaard, and I had...
Casually, as one does.
It was right next to my Reader's Digest in the bathroom.
Up for a little light reading, so I thought I'd read some Kierkegaard.
So anyhow, I was reading some Kierkegaard, and one of the things that he says, and forgive me, I don't remember which of his books it was in.
Sorry. I've read so many.
Weird flex, Tana. Tana, you're such a Judas. All right, so anyhow, this person that may or may not be a Dutch philosopher, I was reading him, and he makes this comment: you can tell the state of Christianity by how they treat Judas. And I don't really remember him going into that deeper, right? Or that's significantly deeper. I just know that one sentence haunted me. And I didn't even know why, right? Because I'm not even sure what that meant, right? But that the state of Christianity can be determined by how its participants, its followers, speak about and think about Judas. Actually, maybe just pause there. What is that like? To me, that just like kind of smacked me in the face and really caused me to slow down. How do you hear that?
Well, to me, it like forces me to reconsider Judas as more of a nuanced person as opposed to this caricature. Because it makes me think that maybe he was getting at the fact that if Judas made a mistake or sinned or whatever we want to call it, then how do we respond to that? And because isn't that part of our Christian faith is sin and forgiveness and things like that?
Yeah.
Yeah, I was thinking something along similar lines where there's a lot of talk about grace in Christianity that I feel like isn't always extended to certain different people. And Judas would be one of those,
Yeah.
Yeah.
So that kind of began my journey. And, I think very similarly to what the two of you said, just kind of reflecting, like, I never really gave Judas any thought other than that he was the bad guy.
Right.
You know what I mean? Like when someone says Judas, I mean, I think images and descriptors that come up are rarely apostle, right? Or
Yeah.
one of the 12,
Right.
right?
Right.
Instead, it's, betrayer, murderer, thief, right? Because we have recorded that, a lot of the stuff, the negative stuff we have about Judas is written by John. It's primarily focused in the Gospel of John. There are some other things that hint at maybe some less than stellar character in the other Gospels, but predominantly, if we remove the Gospel of John, from the discussion, we just look at the synoptic gospels, Judas doesn't come across quite the same way. Because John basically introduces Judas as the betrayer. And so I guess where I want to start with this is, first of all, do we think that Jesus had Judas in place just so he would betray Jesus, turn him over, so Jesus could be killed to fulfill some prophecy? Because I think that's how we treat it.
Yeah.
Right? So what do you guys think? Do you think that...
Wait.
Like he was like the necessary evil that had to just be...
Yeah, and Jesus knew it all along.
Yeah.
And Jesus just... In fact, he wasn't even deserving of being an apostle. He was just a mechanism to make this happen.
I don't feel like that's what I understood growing up. It was, to me, and whether or not this was how it was taught and I just understood it differently or whatever, it just, to me, it was just flat out betrayal. Like, and maybe, I don't know that Jesus had an idea. I don't know. Sorry.
Well, Jesus says one of you will betray me.
Yeah,
But
yeah.
does he know which one when he says that? And maybe he does because that's pretty close to the
Yeah, I mean, it's
actual
at the
event.
Last Supper.
Yeah, it's like...
I mean, it's named the Last Supper. He had to know the time was soon.
But I mean, the way you said it made it sound like even like before he was an apostle,
Yeah.
Jesus knew, kind of a thing. And I don't think that that's how I received it growing up. Or like at some point, Jesus was like, one of you is going to betray me.
Yeah. So a couple of things about Judas that I think is unfair is, one, Matthew. Why do you think when I say it's unfair, and I'm not talking about the Gospel of Matthew, I'm talking about the Apostle Matthew. Why is it unfair what we do to Judas because of Matthew, do you think?
I do
I don't
not
know.
know that I have an idea.
I mean, it's kind of an unfair question, but Matthew was a tax collector, which is probably one of the worst characteristics you can have, and was welcomed into the apostleship. Now, Iscariot could mean that Judas was a part of the, I think it's Sicarii, which is a group of people who opposed Rome and would do it by kind of attacking them and assassinating soldiers and stuff. And they kind of work behind the scenes to very aggressively. So that's some of the tradition that people, because Iscariot kind of is a mystery of what that means. And so people are trying to connect it. So most people assume that at some level, Judas participated in some potentially very violent, and whether he himself was violent, I don't know, but was associated with some groups that were relatively violent towards Rome's occupation of Israel. If you are a Jewish person who is oppressed by Rome, who do you have more favor for? The tax collector getting rich off of you by being in bed with Rome, that's also Jewish, or the Jewish person who is maybe doing things in a way you wouldn't do, but is participating with a group of people that are going out and fighting the oppressors directly.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. You would be more like, yay, revolution.
But at most, we just get like a footnote about Matthew.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
But Judas, we get like this whole attempted backstory and stuff about how he's bad. And I think some of this comes from, in Western culture, we still don't want to quite see Rome as the villain throughout the Gospels. We want the villain to remain the high priesthood.
Yeah.
We don't want the villain to be Rome. Like you said, Easter. Most of us don't blame Rome for the murder of Jesus. We blame the Jewish residents who were put in a weird spot to free one of two slaves, or one of two, slaves, oppressed people, one of two captives, and they were left with the choice of which one to release.
Right.
I mean, are these informed voters? Like, what's going on here? And we then want to make the Jewish people the ones that killed Jesus. So if they would have chose Jesus, would we have said that the Jewish people killed Barabbas? Or would we have said Rome put Barabbas to death? And my guess is we would say Rome eventually put Barabbas to death. They would not say the Jewish people put Barabbas to death. And so I think what's happening here is some of the ways that we have this contextualized is very much pro-Rome, pro-empire, and at best, just anti-Jewish, at worst, anti-Semitic. And now I'm not saying that if you tell the story or told the story this way that you are those things. I'm saying those are the roots of those things. And part of our responsibility, especially as teachers of the text, is to wrestle with why we're teaching what we're teaching. So any thoughts about that before we kind of move further in?
Yeah, it's like the emphasis is, when you put it that way, it's just like the emphasis is on a weird part of it, that like, what's the best thing to do in this crappy scenario? And in terms of releasing which person, and the focus going on there takes off the focus of like, why are we in this crappy scenario? And the bigger picture of like what systems and what have led to like this, and why is this not, how come this can't just not be a scenario? Why can't they, Yeah. So I think that that's very eye-opening to consider, that like, it's like, I mean, not lasered in, but yeah, almost every telling of the story has that dramatic scene of,
Give us
yeah,
Barabbas.
yeah, give us Barabbas, the chanting.
Yeah.
And yeah. Tana?
Yeah. I was sitting here going, as you were saying all that, Don, I was like, no, I've seen Rome as the enemy. And so I had to think back to, because it's been a long time since I was in a different mindset of how to, understand the Bible and everything. And so I had to kind of go back, and I've spoken about this before, where in my Catholic church on Good Friday, the people in the pews would play the Jewish crowd. Mm-hmm. And we had these different things we'd have to say, and we'd be like, give us Barabbas. And then we'd be like, all the things to like, crucify him. Like, and yeah, so growing up, it very much was like, yeah, the Jews killed Jesus kind of.
Well, let's actually just do a list. Who would you say in your upbringing is the most responsible person for the death of Jesus? In your upbringing, not your opinion now.
Oh.
Judas.
Okay. Top is Judas.
Yeah.
Next.
Caiaphas.
Next.
Pontius Pilate.
Oh, you put Pontius Pilate that high?
I did, but
no, that's
yeah.
Because I don't think people do. I think then they pick I think Judas, Caiaphas, Herod.
okay,
I think
so
but I'm just saying, like, and I think the Jewish crowd, and I think what happens is, and because what will all happen with Pontius Pilate is this: even if you maybe put him up high, you'll get the follow up. Mm-hmm. But he washed his hands of it.
Yeah.
Right. Mm-hmm. As if like Jesus is like is some kind of germs on your hands and out damn spot.
Yeah.
It's
that's interesting.
Right. so but I think if we actually did a survey,
Mm-hmm.
I think, especially if you could give caveats, Pontius Pilate might end up in the top 5, but I think a lot of people would make a caveat, but he washed his hands of it.
Yeah.
I think though it's very possible that the reason Pontius Pilate was high up in my mind was because we always had the kids do a little play type thing around this time.
So gruesome.
And a boy I had a crush on played Pontius Pilate. So it's very possible that was just stuck in my head. So Michael Parise, if you're listening, it's It's all your fault.
You really are a Judas.
Yeah, and it's like the washing hands, it's like painted in a way to almost be honorable.
Right.
But it's really like
It's
the
gross.
lowest of the low for like a leader. Like
Yeah. And on top of that, a person was killed and you're like, oh, well, I'm germ free.
yeah.
I think if we blame the Roman soldiers at all, which again, I don't think they would come up on the list very high. I think another caveat that people would make is, but Jesus says from the cross, forgive them for they know not what they do. Mm-hmm. And so again, there was like an innocence to this. You just killed a person. You
Right.
murdered them. You not just murdered them, you tortured them.
Yeah.
And were like, they didn't really know what they were doing. Rome was pretty good at killing people. Like they had it down to a science, literally.
Yeah. They knew what they were doing.
And because of that, I think, again, we just don't give it a pass. So this is all interesting to me because here is Judas, who probably plays one of the smallest parts in this, right? Because what is it that we perceive Judas does?
Well, betrays Jesus.
That
How?
he tells them where Jesus is going to be.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And he's like, I'm going to kiss this guy, and that's the guy you want.
Yeah.
So do you think that they were incapable of following Jesus home?
Yeah, that's something that, yeah. Like, why do they need Judas to do that?
Right. And here's what I would argue is probably the main point of Judas isn't that he turns Jesus over. It's that he leads them in at a moment and in some way they know that Jesus isn't going to fight back with it being Judas. Right. And so if anything, Judas's role in this is about the appropriate time, not where Jesus is. Jesus was going to be killed. Jesus was going to be arrested, and Rome was going to put him to death because he was a threat to quote unquote peace in the form of Pax Romana. And Jesus was a threat to that. And as his reputation grew, the threat grew bigger. So I think that this is another piece for us is as we're thinking about this story, just things just don't seem to line up. Like, did he do this for the money? Right? I mean, according to John, he's been stealing money this whole time, so he doesn't need this money, it seems.
He just wants more.
Yeah, I mean, if it's just pure greed.
Right.
Has anyone asked, is the payoff for this, like, would that have made him wealthy to the point where he never needed to worry about money again? We don't necessarily get that impression, especially since the price is specific to a prophecy in the Bible. So I'm guessing the gospel writer wanted us more so to think about the prophecy of the potter's field, etc., than really that there was some kind of most wanted poster up in the temple and with a reward. So what is it that Judas gets out of this? What do you think? I mean, if Judas is indeed from the group of people that wants to overthrow Rome, the most threatening person to Rome right now is Jesus. What is Judas doing?
Well, I have an answer, but I feel like it's cheating because you've taught this before.
Well, we can go there in a moment, but like, first of all, like if we can set aside our presuppositions or some of the things we've learned over the years, when we think about the way it was taught to us growing up, like what are we imagining Judas got out of this?
I don't think we ever got that far.
Isn't
in
that a
anything.
shame?
Yeah. I mean,
Yeah.
it just doesn't, when you ask that question and I look at it like just kind of at a surface level and then based on how I was taught about Judas, it makes zero sense. Unless he's just greedy. Like that's the only.
Yep.
Or he's the pawn in the story that, was always supposed to do this and
Right.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. Like this was right. His
Predestined
role.
or-
Yeah.
yeah.
So let's go to the Last Supper.
Okay.
So at the Last Supper, Sarah, you mentioned this earlier. Jesus says, somebody will betray me. And what's the reaction of the apostles?
It's like, not me, right?
Yeah, who's it?
I think this is the moment they snapped the photo for the Last Supper picture. Yeah. It's either that or someone had gas, one or the other. So this scene, what is their reply? Anyone remember?
Not me, or who is it?
Yeah, I think it was a lot of no, not me, and
Right.
Who is it? And Jesus says what?
Is that when he says, go and do what you have to do? Or
Not quite.
Not quite
Almost.
yet.
He does say that in a moment.
I can't remember.
Whoever dips their bread into the bowl with me is the person who will betray me. Right? So let's imagine that this Last Supper, what?
I was just thinking, I'll be like, well, I'm not doing it.
I know. Who at that moment picks up a piece of bread and is like, I'm going to dunk it. I don't care. But if indeed Jesus is a person of his contemporaries, I'm assuming that it is, the seating arrangement would have been, at this Last Supper, would have most likely been in the shape of a U. Okay? And at the open end of the U, imagine it upside down, so maybe like a lowercase n, right? At one end of the U would have been the person who was the least of them would have sat, right?
Okay.
Who do we think is there?
Judas?
Tana?
One of the disciples whose name we don't know.
Peter.
Really? Oh, because he would have taken that.
Yes.
Yes.
Because of his teacher.
Right.
Right. And when Jesus washes the feet, Peter says, I should be washing feet because that's the job of the least person at the table. Right. Jesus would have been sitting at the place of respect. Anybody know where that is?
The other side of you?
One from the end on the other side.
Okay.
And then the person from on the end on the other side would have been kind of like the second. Who do you guess, based on the way the text frames things, would have been that person? Primarily.
John?
Yeah, why?
Because he was the beloved, or
Yeah, he calls himself the beloved.
Yeah.
Yeah. So he probably, and also is probably the youngest of all of them.
Huh.
My guess is he was sitting there at the end. And then Jesus would have sat next. Now, obviously, I wasn't there. There's no photos of this happening. No CRTV. But if indeed this is true, even if it's only partially true, one of the things you would do is you would lounge on your left, right? You would lay at a table. You wouldn't sit at a table like we do, us heathens. You would lay at the table on your left elbow, basically, and you would use your right hand, because you would never use your left hand to eat.
Right.
Right? Don't let your left hand know what your right hand's doing. It's all about cleanliness. And so you would have then had a setting in front of you. So imagine your feet out, which is how Jesus's feet got washed at a table. Someone didn't crawl under the table to wash his feet when the woman washed it with the oil, but instead she was behind him and she was able to wash his feet while he reclined at the table. Reaches over, and that's where your food is. Now, what is your total radius for interacting with people in this position?
It would seem like it would be very much.
So it's a U shape.
Yeah.
So there's no one sitting on the inside of the U. Everyone sits around the outside. So the long straight table that, who is the one that, you know what I wanted to say? I want to say Leonardo DiCaprio.
Da Vinci?
Da Vinci's Last Supper. The straight table. Anachronistic. There's a lot of anachronism in that painting, but
Well, it was a panoramic photo, so it made it all.
it looked like it was flat. Yeah. So anyhow, we have this picture of the U, and then no one in the middle. So how many people could have possibly dipped their bread in the same bowl as Jesus?
People on either side of him.
Yes.
So
The
not
person-
John.
The person in front of him or the person behind him. Right? And John wasn't old enough to drink yet, so he wasn't dipping it. And I'm joking. So it's a foregone conclusion based on this. Who's going to dip their bread in with him? But here's the part that's important. Who is it sitting behind him if it's Judas? What does that say about who Judas is amongst the apostles and in the eyes of Jesus?
So with the seating the way it is, would he have been like the third?
Yeah, it would have been like the third seat of honor. Right? This is important. Right? That he was seated there, and we don't get the impression that he stole the seat, that he knocked people out of the way to get there, but that he was invited to that space. I think that that's another moment where us knowing cultural settings and stuff can help us. So in the eyes of Jesus, Judas was of great importance, not just of the 12, right? Jesus had over 100 disciples, and Judas was one of the 12. Earlier in the gospel, before this Last Supper, Jesus says, I tell you at the end of time, these 12, referring to the apostles, will judge all the nations.
Yeah, he doesn't say 11 of the 12.
Yeah, like most of you
Most of you.
are going to judge the nations. Jesus says these 12. So I just want to, I kind of want to play out some of that because I want us to see that Judas was not a bad guy. I realize that much later writings want to tell the story in such a way that makes him into a bad guy. But as far as what we can see from the details of the day-to-day life and the teachings of Jesus, Judas doesn't fall into that category and seems to be very close to Jesus. So if all that's true, let's just say it's plausible. That's the best we can do, right? So let's say that what I'm saying is plausible. What is Judas's motivation?
Is this now where I can answer what I was going to say earlier?
Well, let's see, Sarah, if you have any thoughts, and then if not, Tana can.
Oh, go ahead.
And now I'm afraid I'm mixing up your thoughts with other people's thoughts, but we'll give it a whirl. If Judas was somebody who was trying to overthrow Rome, maybe he was trying to get Jesus to react and actually do it.
Yeah.
Like trying to provoke Jesus into action.
Yeah, I would argue that Judas thought handing Jesus over to come face to face with Caiaphas in the Sanhedrin, that Jesus would have proved that he was Messiah. And by proving that he was Messiah, would have gotten the priesthood behind him and the Jewish leadership behind him. And they would have seen this is the one, right? Neo.
Yeah. I have in the John version of the arrest here, and it says, so Judas brought a detachment of soldiers together with police from the chief priests and Pharisees. So it's like, oh, we're going to bring them along as witnesses too, and then we'll all gather up and rise up.
Yeah.
Sorry, I think you were going to say something.
So, first of all, I want to back up a moment. Jesus says in one of the Gospels, the greatest demonstration of love is what?
To give your
Laying
life
down
for
your life for a friend.
Yep, laying down your life for a friend. When Judas walks into the Garden of Gethsemane with the Sanhedrin, the representatives of the Sanhedrin, Jesus, seeing a police force basically that is coming, not for any conversations around the Passover Seder for sure, walks into the garden, and Jesus says to him what?
Can you repeat your question? I'm sorry.
What does Jesus say to Judas when Judas walks into the garden surrounded with his representatives of the Sanhedrin that are there clearly to arrest Jesus?
He calls him friend, right?
Yeah. He says, "Friend, why are you here?" To me, that's such a profound moment and significant, and one that should be taught every single time we talk about Judas. Unless you think that Jesus is being sarcastic or tongue-in-cheek, he sees these people. They're coming to arrest him. Passover is about to start. It needs to happen if he is going to be arrested and killed. That is the night it has to happen. And instead of Jesus trying to run like Peter or lie like Peter, Jesus walks right up to Judas and says, "Friend, why are you here?" And I think Judas answers the question. Not in the text, but I think Judas answers the question. How would you say Judas answers that question? What's some oddities that we have around this trial that happens?
Around the
trial of Jesus.
small oddities.
There's one big glaring one.
The time of day?
Yeah, it's in the middle of the night.
Yeah.
They arrest him and put him on trial immediately. We get the impression that not all of the Sanhedrin is there. And so we see this all the time in politics today, where people push things through quickly when other people are absent in order to, get what they want.
Yeah.
Jesus is arrested, immediately put on trial, and immediately by morning, before the cock crows 3 times, is found guilty. Now, let's imagine this is what Judas wanted. What's Judas's response in the multiverse where this is indeed what Judas wanted? What do you think? He turns Jesus over. By morning, Jesus is found guilty, and he's paid.
Good, now I can do things the way I think they should be done.
Yeah, or first plane to Morocco, right? Like, he's excited. He should be celebrating. It played out exactly. The plan could not have gone more flawless. He got to hang out with Jesus the night before, had a few drinks with him, then got to turn him in. No blood was shed, not much blood was shed. And Jesus is arrested and taken and found guilty. Man, nailed it. Flawless execution. And he got paid. He didn't even get screwed over out of his payment. Right?
Yeah.
What's his actual response?
Torment.
Yeah, he says something.
Regret.
Anybody remember what he says?
No, not exactly.
No, I don't.
Tana, why don't you Google it to get the exact, because I'm doing this from memory.
Yeah.
But he says, "Today I have killed an innocent man." Now, he doesn't get to sit in on the trial. No one does. It's just the Sanhedrin and Jesus behind closed doors, right?
Yeah.
Did something happen? We don't read anything in the text that he was visited by an angel or that he got new information overnight.
Yeah.
Instead, the only thing that changed is a guilty verdict.
Yeah.
Did you find it?
So, Matthew 27, 3-8. is where this is found. When Judas, his betrayer, saw that Jesus was condemned, he repented and brought back the 30 pieces of silver to the chief priests and the elders. He said, I have sinned by betraying innocent blood.
Yeah. So this is his response. So if nothing else has changed other than the verdict, why does he say that?
Because that's not the result he wanted.
What do you think the result was?
Seeing that he had been condemned.
For Jesus to fight back.
Yeah, seeing that he had been condemned. I don't think he ever imagined that he was going to get Jesus killed.
Yeah, because if that's what he thought would happen, or if he was kind of resigned himself or something, he might say, I regret my actions or something like that.
I've changed my mind, or I've now been convinced.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right. So people might want to point to a flaw in this by pointing to the Last Supper where it says, and the devil entered him.
Oh.
I want to be very clear here. In that era, the devil was not anthropomorphic. We've talked about this many times, did not have red tail and horns, and was not anthropomorphic. Instead, the devil, or the Satan, was what?
Evil inclination.
Right. And even that, sometimes I think we take, but basically evil inclination primarily means doing something our way regardless.
Yeah.
Right. So Peter, when says to Jesus that Jesus shouldn't go up to Jerusalem, remember that story? Mm-hmm. And Jesus is like, I'm going to Jerusalem. Peter steps in and says, you should not go to Jerusalem.
Says, get behind me, Satan.
And Jesus says, get behind me, Satan. It's not because Peter embodied the horn, long-tailed, whatever version of the devil. It's because Peter was trying to manipulate things in the way that he perceived were best. Mm-hmm. And Jesus was trying to do what he thought was the most honorable towards God. Right?
Yeah.
And so when it says the devil entered him, I think more so what is being portrayed. Well, actually here, what do you guys think? When it says the devil entered him, what does that tell you? Like, what do you think is actually happening there? If we could rewrite that, especially since we have a whole bunch of baggage with devil.
Yeah.
How would we rewrite that scene?
Like he started to think of a different way that things could go. Like he had an idea that if he did this, then it might move things in the direction that he wanted to see it happen. You know, more like just like he's having an epiphany, or if it's an actual moment, then more of like an epiphany idea. But if it's not an actual moment, then also just like this brewing idea of how another way that this could play out.
Yeah.
But still, ultimately, he's on that team.
Yes.
He's working towards the same goal, but he just thinks that this is the way to get to the goal.
Yeah. And why sorry, Tana, do you have something you want to add to that?
No.
Why do you think the night before Passover starts, right? Why do you think that's the night? Not for them to come kill him. I already mentioned that seemed like the right time. It was gonna happen. But why do you think Judas imagines tonight's the night? Tonight's the one.
Is it the connection to Passover? Like is there an Exodus connection there?
I don't know. You tell me. I mean, I have thoughts, but you tell me.
I mean, it feels like...
What do you do at a Passover Seder?
Well, a lot of things. But, well, I'm thinking the connection is like the freedom. Like, you know, all the stuff that happened with the within the Exodus story led to the Jewish people being freed from Egypt. Mm-hmm. And so I'm thinking Judas might think there's a parallel there of, you know, I do this thing and then we are freed from Rome.
I mean, I don't know that he thought it that simply, but I mean, keep going with this idea? I mean, you just spent the whole night drinking and eating, telling the stories of how Egypt oppressed Israel.
Yeah.
And how Israel finally decides to stand up to Pharaoh through Moses, and goes and gets Israel out of slavery and bondage. Like, you just spent the entire night talking about those stories and drinking a little while doing so.
Right.
Yeah.
I think it's obvious to me that this story, this moment, this Exodus narrative, this Passover Seder, this storytelling of Israel and confronting empire and confronting the oppressor and forcing their way out. And if Judas is indeed convinced that Jesus is Messiah, then he has his Moses.
Yeah.
Moses is sitting right here. And we're talking about Passover. One other piece I think is important. Why else tonight? Or Sarah, do you have anything you want to add to that piece before? Okay. So why else that night or that timing?
I am drawing a blank.
I don't know.
So Israel is in the diaspora. Means they're no longer centralized in Jerusalem and Israel any longer. They're all over the world. There are a handful of events per year that what happens?
Everybody.
They gather.
They all show up in Jerusalem. Guess what holiday it is, and guess what happens at that holiday?
They're all gathered.
They're all gathered. The entire nation of Israel is there. They are there in numbers. They are there in power. They are there in force. Rome at this moment is the most vulnerable.
Right. And so Judas probably sees this as this, like, well, if I can just get Jesus to grasp this moment, we're all here.
Yeah.
Or he sees it as an ordained moment.
Or, yeah.
Right? We've talked on here before about people play the God card in things.
Yeah.
I think Judas could have stitched this together to think that this was his calling.
Yeah.
Oh, sure. Yeah. Yeah.
Like, I have a connection inside the Sanhedrin. I know Jesus is Messiah. We already have millions of people here. Everyone is talking about overthrowing empire. Every single dinner table that night in Israel was talking about overthrowing the oppressor. And Judas is like, this is the night. I mean, I don't blame him. Do you?
No.
It all makes sense.
Yeah. Yeah.
How many of us have seen the writing on the wall, read the tea leaves, whatever things, felt prompted by God, and it blow up in our face?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think Judas genuinely believed Jesus to be Messiah. That's why he leaves this group, if indeed that is the case, this subversive, violent group, to go and attach himself and study and learn from and walk at the feet of Messiah. And I think that in this moment, Judas was like, I know what my job is. Tonight's the night.
Yeah.
It's gonna happen. And how all the people are here, all the stories are being told. This is the moment. How does that, I just want to, I realized that was a lot of information. But does that at all begin to, and I know, Tana, you have, and Sarah, I assume to some degree you've heard me talk about this at some level in the past because I love this topic. what begins to shift, or what would you imagine, or maybe the first times maybe we've talked about this, that things shifted. So what now do you think about Judas?
It's more like misguided, rather than evil,
Yeah.
and that also, makes me think, you said the God card.
Mm-hmm.
I'm sure there are plenty of us who are absolutely convinced, like you said, we've read the tea leaves and we think like, oh, this is the thing God wants me to do. And it's not. And, there's a part of me that's like, I'm trying to piece this together. I'm sorry. I think there are some people who are just like, well, that was a sin and therefore God's going to condemn you and blah, blah, blah. And I'm thinking, well, but if you're genuinely trying and you genuinely believe you're doing what is best, like, I don't know, there's part of me that's like, I feel like God would understand that. Like, you know what I mean? So it makes me feel like there's not so much of a cut and dried, like, these people are right, these people are wrong, these people are evil, these people are good. It's much more nuance.
Yeah.
Did any of that make sense?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. So.
Well, as per usual, I don't have an application for you.
Well, I think one application is to maybe be more understanding of, one of the things that frustrates me within Christianity is that there's multiple denominations who think they're the only right denomination. And
they're really just a bunch of Judases, is what you're saying?
No. Maybe,
You can.
Maybe some of them.
Actually, no. You could say that now that we've reformed what Judas means.
Yeah. We've... But you threw me off. It's this idea that there's one correct way to believe about God and Jesus and the Bible, and and it's like, and we have it, and those people don't, or we have it and those people don't, and I just think that it's all more complicated than that, and it's more nuanced. And I also think that there's probably like, all I can think of is like a cable, a time they give you for installing the cable. It's between 11 and 2, and God's like, as long as you're between 11 and 2, it's good. So
I actually wholeheartedly agree with that. Other than the cable analogy,
comparing God to the cable guy.
I think that's making us the cable guy.
That's true. That's true. Yeah, it's just like I don't know. It almost feels like people are like, well, Christianity is this little tiny thing and you have to fit in there perfectly. And I just think like it's not. It's broader than that.
Yes, agreed.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, anyway.
Yeah, I think that's a good point, and like when we get caught up in thinking that there's like only one way, or that our whole theology is going to fall apart if one gospel says something different than another.
Yeah.
And as opposed to like looking at these stories with all the nuance, it makes it so much more real to me, because it just puts me into looking at the story as less of a caricature or a cartoon or like a going through the motions or a dramatic reading at church, and actually trying to imagine this historical moment and the implications of that, make it real. And just reminded that these were people too. So
Yeah.
having the good and the bad, and the good intentions and the evil or less than good intentions is kind of like isn't that all of us?
Right. Yeah. Yeah. So.
Let me just give two things that I think are common objections to this teaching.
Okay.
One is he's called the betrayer. Mm-hmm. Literally, that Greek word means the one who handed something over.
Oh, that's interesting.
Like, I could be a betrayer by handing this, what's in my hand, over to Sarah or Tana. Like, that would be the definition. Like, I handed something that I had in my possession and I gave it to you for your possession. That is what the Greek there means. Not necessarily attach any moral like we do with betrayer.
Sure.
Right? Like, I think betrayer is probably closer, or the Greek word there's probably closer to the word like trader, like someone who trades. Mm-hmm. And someone can be called a traitor or a trader. Mm-hmm. I don't know if the D versus the T. But that's the first one. That's the first objection. The second objection I often hear with this, around this is, but it doesn't the text say it would have been better off for him to have never been born? And the answer is yeah. Think about what Christianity's done to him the last 2,000 years.
Right.
Think about what Kierkegaard says.
Yeah.
Right? Yes, it probably would have been for what he went through and the torture that finally led to him ending his own life.
Yeah.
In fact, as a person who struggles with suicidal ideations, that is the exact statement that I wrestle with every day, and other people who struggle with suicidal ideations do. And I'm certain Judas did on that day. With this would have been better if I was just never born.
Yeah.
So those are the two objections I just want to point out. I don't think that they undo what we talked about. One other piece I just want to mention as we close. Other than the cultural setting of what took place at a Seder meal, and maybe the table helped give us some visualizing, but I think even if we left out the table at the Last Supper, we still would have ended up at the same place. I think we just would have, that just solidifies a little bit more where Judas was in the eyes of Jesus. And the fact that the diaspora shows up at Jerusalem for Passover, amongst other high holidays. This was just taking off the lenses that we've been handed and reading the text. Right? We didn't do any fancy stuff in there. We just talked about, and maybe given a background a little bit to Iscariot, but all of this stuff is very common and easy to get hold of. There is nothing about this story that is complicated when we just read it through and ask questions. And maybe that's where we often get stuck, right? Is we were taught something, and so when we read it, we accept what we were taught, and that's the lens we read it through, instead of allowing ourselves to continue to still ask questions.
Right. Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah. Well, that seems like a good place to stop. Unless you have any final thoughts, Sarah, you want to share?
No.
Okay. So yeah, thanks for joining us, and we'll see you next time.
Bye.
See ya.
Thanks for joining us for today's podcast. If you want to learn more about AJFF, please visit ajffpodcast.com or check out our YouTube channel, which is at AJFF. We'll be off for a little while, but we'll be back this summer for season 3, so stay tuned.